"You're everything wrong with this country," the protester yelled, his voice cutting through the quiet of the park before he hurled an egg at the old Marine's chest. The egg burst against the deep blue of the dress uniform, streaking across the medals and ribbons that marked decades of service. Gunnery Sergeant Marcus "Gunny" Thorne, retired, stood motionless, his eyes closing not in anger, but in memory. 50 years earlier, in a muddy field far from home, a group of Mexican farmers had risked everything to drag his wounded body to safety after an ambush. That act of courage had stayed with him ever since. Now, as the crowd gasped and the egg dripped down his uniform, Gunny Thorne turned to face his accuser, prepared to share a story no one in the crowd expected. At the city's memorial, the ceremony continued, the weight of tradition and sacrifice hanging in the air. Sunlight filtered through bare November branches. As the ceremony moved forward, Gunnery Sergeant Thorne stood at attention, his dress blues immaculate, every ribbon and medal aligned with care. The silver eagle insignia on his collar caught the light as the mayor addressed the crowd about duty and remembrance. Several dozen people gathered around the granite monument, local veterans, officials, and residents who had come to honor those who served. Off to one side, a handful of protesters hovered near the park's edge, their signs bobbing above the crowd. Their chants drifted in and out, no more wars, fun schools, not bombs, faint but persistent beneath the mayor's speech. Gunny Thorne's gaze stayed fixed on the wreath of red and white carnations at the base of the memorial. His posture never faltered, though old wounds ached beneath the surface. He wasn't listening to the speeches. Instead, he was recalling names of young Marines he'd lost, men who had never made it home. As the mayor spoke of deployments and sacrifice, the protesters' voices swelled. One young man, thin and restless with a shock of dyed red hair, broke away from the group. His jacket was covered in anarchist patches, and his fists clenched as he pushed through the bystanders. People moved aside, uneasy. A woman stiffened as he brushed past her. Gunny didn't react. His eyes remained steady, focused somewhere beyond the monument, as if watching for movement in a distant tree line. Nearby, park security and a couple of city police officers kept a careful watch, but didn't intervene as the protester advanced. He stopped a few paces from Thorne, hurling insults about imperialism and oil wars. The mayor faltered, his speech trailing off. From the crowd, someone called out, "Show some respect." Gunny blinked once, slowly. His fingertips brushed the edge of his left sleeve, where a scar still tingled before storms. The bugler began to play taps, the notes rising and falling in the chilly air. Gunny's shoulders squared, the music triggering a memory of too many funerals. The protester hesitated, caught between anger and uncertainty. For a moment, it looked as if he might turn back. Instead, he reached into his jacket. Park security tensed, but held their position. Gunny exhaled, slow and steady. Behind them, the protesters' chanting faded into uneasy murmurs. The red-haired man pulled an egg from his pocket. It wasn't a weapon, not in the strict sense, but the intent was clear. Gunny didn't turn or flinch. He remained facing the memorial, eyes locked on the wreath, as if it anchored him to the present. The moment hung suspended, the crowd silent, waiting for what would come next. The egg struck the veteran's chest with a wet slap, yellow yolk streaking across his medals, the Navy Cross, the Purple Heart, campaign ribbons from 3 wars. The protester's throw came sidearm, sharp and deliberate, his face twisted with something raw. Yolk and albumin ran down the deep blue wool, pooling in the crevices of the medals, bright against the polished brass. The stains stood out on the immaculate uniform, a visible insult to everything the dress blues represented. A low, unsettled noise rippled through the crowd, obscenities mixed with shocked whispers. A woman pulled her child behind her. Gunnery Sergeant Thorne didn't move. He kept his posture rigid, chin level, eyes closed for 3 long seconds as the egg dripped onto his belt buckle. His breathing stayed even, his stance unchanged. Only the slightest curl of his fingers against his trouser seams betrayed any reaction, stretching the fabric taut. The uniform regulations he'd lived by demanded immediate attention to any stain discipline made visible. But he stood motionless, letting the yolk cling to his silver star, filling the tiny engraving with sticky residue. 3 police officers moved in quickly. 2 grabbed the protester's arms. The third stepped between him and the veteran. The protester didn't resist. A crooked grin flashed across his face, teeth bared. "That's for a lifetime of war," he spat, voice ragged. The officers began to haul him away. Thorne opened his eyes as the protester was pulled back. His expression didn't shift, but something distant flickered there. Not anger, something deeper. The sharp scent of egg and wool mixed with the metallic tang of brass polish. But in his mind, the smells blurred into something else. Rotting vegetation. The thick humidity of a far-off rice paddy. His left hand twitched at his side, tracing an old scar beneath the fabric. For a moment, the crowd's noise faded, replaced by the memory of buzzing mosquitoes and the labored breathing of a friend lost decades ago. An older woman from the crowd hurried over, a packet of tissues in hand. She paused, unsure if she should touch the stained uniform. Thorne shook his head once, and she stepped back. The bugler, a teenage ROTC cadet, had lowered his instrument, uncertain. No one clapped as the protester was led away. Instead, they watched the veteran, phones raised, searching for a reaction that didn't come. The officers had the protester cuffed and were leading him toward a squad car when Thorne cleared his throat. The sound was quiet but firm. The nearest officer stopped. "Let him go," Thorne said, his voice flat. Not a plea or a reprimand, just an order delivered with the weight of years. The officers glanced at each other. The protester, suddenly uncertain, looked back at the veteran. "No charges," Thorne added. He glanced down at the yolk drying on his chest, flicked a piece of shell from his ribbon bar, and watched it land on the granite base of the memorial. Then he turned to face the monument again, his stained uniform on display, as if nothing had happened. The mayor tried to speak, but Thorne cut him off with a nod to the bugler. "Play!" The cadet swallowed and began taps again, the notes thin and trembling in the cold air. Thorne stood at attention, face still, as the egg stiffened on his dress blues. His mind drifted far from the ceremony, carried by memory. He remembered November 1969, the flooded paddies of Quang Tri Province, and the sound of gunfire splitting the morning haze. His patrol had just started across the slick, knee-deep water when the tree line erupted with AK-47 fire. He'd seen the corporal to his left drop, face first into the mud. Then the shockwave from an RPG lifted him off his feet, slamming him into the water. When he tried to move, his right leg refused. His M16 was caked with mud and useless. The rest of his squad was gone, either scattered or dead. What happened next never fit the stories passed around at the VFW. 4 men appeared at the edge of the field, moving quickly through the grass. They wore conical hats, pant legs rolled up, and their skin was tanned from months in the sun. They weren't Vietnamese villagers, though. He caught the Spanish words they muttered: Mexican contract workers, hired by the U.S. to help with logistics and rice harvests. They had no reason to risk themselves for a wounded Marine. Still, one put a finger to his lips, signaling for silence. Together, they hoisted him up, struggling with his weight, and carried him sideways through the paddies, careful to keep low. Twice, bullets cracked over their heads. Each time, the oldest worker barked a command and they froze, knees sinking deeper into the muck, until the shooting stopped. He faded in and out as they moved, the sky spinning above him. When he woke, it was in a thatched hut with bamboo walls. A teenage boy sat beside him, spooning thin broth into his mouth. An older woman, hands tough as old leather, peeled back his trouser leg and cleaned the wound with rice whiskey. She dug out the shrapnel with blacksmith's tongs heated over a candle. The pain was sharp, but he bit down and didn't make a sound. Later, he learned the workers were Mexican Catholics, brought over as laborers before the war escalated. Their village was marked for reprisals if anyone found out they'd helped an American. They risked everything for him and asked nothing in return. A week passed before a Marine recon team arrived, led there by the contract workers. Their footprints washed away in the typhoon rains. When the lieutenant tried to thank them with cigarettes and cash, the oldest man simply pointed to the crucifix Thorne wore, and made the sign of the cross. Then they disappeared, silent as they'd come. He never learned their names. Over the years, he searched through old records, asked around at Catholic charities, even checked with embassy staff after the war. Nothing. By 1975, most of the rural Catholic workers had vanished, either fled or killed. But their faces, the boy's careful hands, the woman's steady voice remained clearer to him than any medal. Back home in California, he'd been different. He requested duty at Camp Pendleton, where many of the janitorial staff were Mexican immigrants. He brought tamales to share on night shifts, learned enough Spanish to joke with the older men, and made sure the new hires got the safety gear they needed. The young ones called him Jefe. Nobody ever asked why a decorated Marine captain cared about the cleaning crew. Decades later, when immigration debates filled the news and protests swept the streets, he kept his opinions quiet. He donated to legal aid groups and remembered the boy who wiped sweat from his brow with a rag dipped in well water, the woman who sang hymns while she changed his bandages. The egg thrown at him today didn't matter. What stayed with him was the memory of those four figures, vanishing into rain, while he lay alive because of their courage. The ceremony's noise returned, voices rising and falling in the cold air. Thorne's gaze shifted, catching the movement near the curb where the protester sat, wrists cuffed behind his back. A hush settled over the park as the veteran approached, his uniform still streaked with yolk and the faint outline of medals beneath the stains. The protester looked up, expecting anger or a lecture, but the veteran's face gave nothing away. He stopped just out of reach, his presence steady, the crowd closing in behind him. "You think you know me?" The veteran's voice was calm, each word clear. The protester's bravado wavered. He shifted on the curb, the cuffs biting into his wrists. "I know your type," the protester said, but his tone had lost its edge. "You probably want to build walls, deport families. Veterans, always." The veteran raised his hand, not in warning, just to pause the words. The crowd grew still, even the officers pausing their routine. A teenager in an ill-fitting ROTC jacket watched, unsure whether to step in. 1969. The veteran began, voice steady but edged with memory. "Quang Tri Province. My squad was hit crossing a rice paddy. I was shot, couldn't move. My corpsman died, trying to save me." The protester's eyes flickered, but he didn't look away. "So what? That's war. What's it got to do with—" "Farmers pulled me out," the veteran said. "Mexican contract workers. They carried me for miles, right through the firefight. I owe my life to men who risked everything for someone they didn't know." He touched the ruined bar on his chest, the medals now streaked with yellow. "This medal? Their names are on the back. Not mine." The protester's jaw tightened. He stared at the ground, sneakers stained from his own act. The officers glanced at each other, waiting for a signal. "You threw that egg because you assumed," the veteran said. "Assumed the uniform meant one thing. Assumed the man inside it believed what you feared." He glanced at the protesters still hovering near the park entrance. "I swore an oath to defend your right to say what you want. Even this." He gestured to the stained uniform. "But you never asked. You just assumed." A woman in the crowd wiped her eyes. The ROTC cadet shifted his weight, hands clenched. The protester was silent. The veteran turned to the officers. "Take the cuffs off. No charges," he said. "It would only waste taxpayer money." The senior officer hesitated, then unlocked the cuffs. The protester rubbed his wrists, but stayed on the curb. One of the officers leaned in, voice low. "We're getting pressure from the DA to file assault charges, maybe even hate crime enhancements." The veteran shook his head. "No charges. Let it go." The protester stared up at him, his earlier defiance gone. "I thought—" "I know what you thought." The veteran pulled a folded photo from his pocket, edges worn thin. He held it out. "Next time, ask." The protester took the photo, studying the image of a younger Marine, surrounded by muddy, smiling men in straw hats and work clothes. The crowd murmured, phones lowered. The veteran turned, walking back toward the memorial, his uniform marked but his steps unhurried. The protester stood, still holding the photo, uncertain. The crowd parted as the veteran reached the center of the park, the sun catching the stained medals on his chest. All eyes followed him as he faced the crowd once more. He began to speak, not to defend himself, but to clarify a truth that had been shaped by the worst and best moments of his life. November 1969, Quang Tri Province. I was hit during an ambush, couldn't move. I thought I'd die in that field. His voice was steady, not dramatic, just matter of fact. I was saved by 3 Mexican contract workers. They dragged me out, patched me up, and carried me to safety. Their names are etched in my memory, and on the back of my Silver Star, Navy Cross, and Purple Heart. Not because the medals matter, but because they do. He paused, letting the words settle. The protester, still holding the worn photo, stood motionless. The crowd seemed to shrink in around them, drawn by the simplicity of the story and the weight it carried. Those men risked everything. They were civilians, not soldiers. They didn't owe me a thing. They could have walked away, but they didn't. I've spent years searching for them, for any trace. I never found them. But every good thing I've had since then, every chance, every bit of kindness came from people like them. He glanced down at the dried yolk on his dress blues, the medals dulled by the stain. When I came home, I found help in the same place. My neighbors, the Rices, never asked about my scars or my uniform. They just showed up when I needed them. They brought food, fixed my porch, treated me like family. No talk of borders, no questions about paperwork, just people helping people. He met the protester's gaze, voice quiet but unwavering. You saw this uniform and assumed you knew who I was. You thought it stood for hate. But the truth is, everything I value me life. My community was given to me by people you thought I should despise. The men who saved me, the families who welcomed me, the veterans who served beside me, now they're the reason I'm here. He let the silence stretch, the crowd absorbing the confession. My VFW Post-12 Mexican members, combat vets, just like me. The medals on my chest aren't just mine. They belong to everyone who carried me, who stood beside me, who never asked for thanks. He stepped back, folding the photo and sliding it into his pocket. Next time you want to make a statement, ask first. You might learn something you didn't expect. A faint vibration ran through the ground, almost imperceptible at first, hinting that something else was about to shift. The crowd's attention remained fixed on the veteran, but a new tension seemed to ripple through the air, subtle, yet unmistakable. The first indication was a faint vibration beneath the concrete, almost easy to dismiss until it grew into a steady pulse. The sound of diesel engines followed, low and insistent, punctuated by the metallic rattle of suspension under heavy weight. Heads turned as Humvees and light armored vehicles appeared at the park entrance, their olive drab paint streaked from field exercises. The column moved with purposino wasted motion, no confusion. 2 AH-1 attack helicopters swept overhead, their rotors sending a cold wind across the grass, making protest signs flutter and pushing loose programs into the air. The vehicles rolled to a stop in a tight arc around the memorial. Marines dismounted in practice sequence, boots hitting the pavement in perfect cadence. They wore full gear, 916-4s secured across their vests, helmets cinched, faces set in quiet focus. Their patches marked them as part of a Marine Expeditionary Unit, a reminder that the Corps never operated alone. They didn't shout or gesture. Each Marine took up a position along the park's perimeter, forming a living barrier between the crowd and the memorial. The crowd's chatter died away. Protesters at the edge of the park hesitated, uncertain whether to leave or stay, while police officers instinctively stepped back. The sergeant major, his ribbons neat and uniform crisp, walked up to the veteran. There was no salute, just a brief, silent acknowledgement between two men who understood the weight of the moment. Without ceremony, the sergeant major addressed the police captain. "We'll take security from here." It wasn't a request. The captain glanced at the Marines flanking him, recognized the authority in their stance, and nodded. The Marines moved with efficiency, establishing a secure perimeter in minutes, their presence both reassurance and warning. No public call had gone out. Officially, the city hadn't requested assistance, but a retired master gunnery sergeant had recognized the situation unfolding, initiated a code red protocol with a single phone call. The Marine Corps responded as it always had, swiftly, decisively, and with overwhelming support for its own. The egg-throwing protester watched as a corporal checked his restraints, then removed them with a practiced motion. She didn't speak, just ensured he was free to stand, and then moved on. The veteran accepted a clean uniform shirt from a lance corporal, tags still attached, the fabric stiff with starch. He held it for a moment, eyes tracing the familiar seams. The sergeant major surveyed the scene, eyes lingering on the egg stains and scattered protest signs. He spoke quietly to the veteran. "Your ride's here when you're ready." Then he turned away, his boots leaving straight tracks through the grass. The helicopters hovered overhead for a final pass before peeling away, the thrum of rotors fading as they gained altitude. The Marines did not clear the crowd or confiscate phones. They simply stood, silent and watchful, their presence enough to reset the boundaries of the gathering. When the veteran moved toward the waiting Humvee, the Marines formed up around him, not as an honor guard, but as a silent escort. The crowd parted, the only sound the measured cadence of boots on pavement. As the Marines guided the veteran away, the protester remained seated on the curb, his wrists marked by the cuffs but now free. The moment lingered, the memory of the response settling over the park. The protester sat on the curb, wrists free but still marked, feeling the weight of what had just unfolded. The presence of the Marines had shifted the atmosphere entirely. What started as a defiant gesture now felt exposed, even small. He caught sight of a corporal stationed nearby, her name tape reading, Hernandez. The name echoed in his mind, matching the one the veteran had spoken of, a corpsman, Raul Hernandez, who died decades ago. That coincidence landed hard, sharper than any rebuke. He looked up as the veteran approached, each step measured, not rushed. The egg stains had dried, metals slightly askew, but the man's bearing was unchanged. There was no anger in his face, just a steady calm. The protester forced himself upright, knees unsteady. The Marine Hernandez remained at her post, eyes forward, her presence a quiet reminder of the story he just heard. "You threw an egg at me," the veteran said, stopping close enough for his words to land without force. The protester felt the urge to defend himself, to explain, but nothing came out. He noticed the veteran's left hand tremble faintly, a detail he'd missed before. The veteran didn't linger on the act. You think the uniform means just one thing, but it's carried by all kinds of people, for all kinds of reasons. He touched his ribbons, streaked and bent. "My first squad leader was a Chicano kid from East LA. He taught me more about leadership than any officer ever did." Nearby, a Humvee idled, its engine a steady backdrop. The protester pressed his palms into his jeans, feeling the grit beneath his fingers. "I thought," he started, but the veteran cut him off, not with anger, just honesty. "You didn't think, you reacted. I did the same once, in '69. Fired before I was sure. Regret comes after, if you let it." The protester looked down at his shoes, the laces frayed and dirty. His actions felt automatic now, like tying those laces done without thought, without seeing the whole picture. The veteran reached into his pocket and produced a small, worn Marine Corps challenge coin. He tossed it, and the protester caught it awkwardly against his chest. "Juan gave me that," the veteran said, voice almost soft. 3 days before he died, he told me don't mistake different colors for enemies." Turning the coin over, the protester traced the faded eagle, globe and anchor, feeling the nick along the edge. The words settled in, uncomfortable but real. "Do you understand now?" the veteran asked. He nodded, not fully understanding, but feeling something shift. He tried to hand the coin back, but the veteran shook his head. "Keep it. Maybe next time you'll ask before you act." Behind them, the Marines began to reassemble, moving with practiced efficiency. No one stared at him with contempt or sympathy, just a neutral, appraising look. The veteran turned and walked away, his uniform marked but his steps unwavering. The protester stood still, the coin warm in his palm. He thought about the names on those medals, the stories behind them, and the people he'd never bothered to see. Corporal Hernandez glanced his way, then looked past him, her face unreadable. Engines rumbled, and the last Humvee pulled away, leaving the park quieter than before. The protester lingered, rubbing his thumb over the coin, the sound of the crowd behind him shifting from shock to something softer, almost reflective. A subtle shift moved through the crowd as the last of the commotion faded. Where moments before there had been raised voices, phones held high, and a restless undercurrent, now people stood in a kind of suspended quiet. The mayor, his face drawn, stepped forward, careful not to disturb the scattered eggshells beneath his polished shoes. He spoke in measured tones, offering the city's regret for what had happened, and insisting that the act did not reflect the values of the community. The crowd listened, but their focus remained fixed on the veteran, whose posture had not wavered since the egg struck his uniform. The murmurs spread outward, phones lowered, and tension drained from the air. A few people exchanged glances, some embarrassed by the spectacle, others simply unsure what to do next. Several veterans in the front row removed their caps, holding them against their chests in a silent gesture of solidarity. The mayor's words hung in the air, but it was the veteran's response that carried weight. He shook his head, quietly dismissing the idea that the incident was about politics or party lines. It was about assumptions, he said, his voice even, the stained fabric of his dress blues drawing every eye. A hush settled. The city councilwoman stood behind the mayor, dabbing her eyes with a tissue, while a boy in an oversized jacket stepped forward. He offered the veteran a white handkerchief, his hands trembling. "My grandpa was in Vietnam too," he said, voice barely above a whisper. The veteran accepted the handkerchief, folding it and placing it in his pocket, a small nod of thanks passing between them. Across the grass, the protesters who had gathered earlier now stood grouped together, their signs lowered, their energy spent. One woman broke away, dragging her placard behind her as she approached a Marine standing watch. She spoke quietly, her words lost to the wind, and the Marine gave a single nod in reply. The protest group quickly distanced themselves from the egg thrower, making it clear both through their words and their actions that his outburst was not theirs to own. Police officers lingered at the edge of the crowd, waiting for direction. The captain approached the veteran, offering to press charges. The veteran refused, his tone final. He got the message. There was no anger, only a sense that something had shifted. The protester, still clutching the challenge coin, stared at the ground, the earlier defiance gone. A ripple of agreement moved through the bystanders. A black veteran in a wheelchair nodded, hands folded in his lap. Two college students who had come with protest signs now leaned them against a trash can, faces turned away. The mayor, searching for some way to make amends, hesitated before retreating to the edge of the crowd. People began to drift away in small groups, their conversations hushed, gestures subdued. Some paused to look back at the veteran, standing alone by the memorial, his uniform still marked by the egg but his bearing unchanged. The Marines remained at the edge of the park, their vehicles idling, a quiet presence rather than a show of force. A reporter approached, notebook in hand, but the veteran redirected her to the protester, suggesting she ask him what he'd learned. The reporter complied, and the veteran's shoulders eased, his stance less rigid. As the last of the daylight faded, the bugler packed away his instrument, and the crowd thinned to only a few lingering figures. The park grew quiet again, the memorial undisturbed, wreath still fresh at its base. Nothing had been swept away or hidden. The marks of what had happened remained in plain sight. As the veteran turned from the crowd, something in the air suggested that the day was not quite finished, that a final gesture was still to come. 12 Marines in full dress quietly moved into position, forming a precise square around Gunnery Sergeant Thorne. Their boots scraped against the pavement as they faced outward, not as a show of force, but as a living shield and unmistakable sign of respect. The sergeant major gave a subtle signal and the formation tightened, closing ranks until the veteran stood at the center, surrounded by the Corps' silent affirmation. A corporal stepped forward, holding a plastic-wrapped bundle. The clear packaging caught the sunlight as he peeled it away, revealing a new set of dress blues: jacket, trousers, and cover, each crease sharp and untouched. The corporal presented it, arms extended, posture rigid. No words passed between them. The gesture was enough. Thorn reached out, his fingertips brushing the wool, the gold buttons gleaming brighter than the ones on his stained uniform. He accepted the bundle, feeling the weight and care behind it. There was no need to check the size. The Marines always made sure it would fit. The sergeant major remained silent, his presence steady. The replacement uniform spoke for the Corps. We honor your sacrifice. We restore what was lost. We stand with you. Thorn's hands were steady as he accepted the uniform, though his breath caught for a moment. He didn't unfold it. He simply held it, knowing what it meant. Behind the cordon, a Humvee's rear hatch opened. Thorn glanced toward it, and the sergeant major nodded once. The crowd, sensing the importance of the moment, stilled. The veteran walked toward the waiting vehicle, the new dress blues cradled in his arms, the Marines moving with him in perfect step. Their boots struck the pavement in unison, echoing off the granite of the memorial. Inside the Humvee, a private waited with a uniform bag and a small stool. Thorn stepped inside, the shadow of the vehicle swallowing him for less than a minute. When he emerged, the egg-stained uniform was gone, replaced by the crisp new blues. The medal's Navy Cross, Purple Heart, Bronze Star had been transferred with precision, each perfectly aligned. Only a faint tremor in his hands betrayed the emotion beneath the surface as he adjusted the cover on his head. The sergeant major approached with a black case. Inside was a formal commendation and a letter of apology from the Corps, both presented without fanfare. Thorn accepted them, tracing the embossed letters with his thumb. The Marines stood at attention, their faces unreadable, but their respect unmistakable. The Humvee engines idled, ready to depart. The Marine formation dissolved with a single command, each member jogging briskly back to their vehicles. In moments, Thorn stood alone, his new uniform immaculate, the commendation and letter tucked securely under his arm. The crowd began to disperse, their footsteps soft against the scattered fragments of eggshell on the ground. Thorn paused, the late afternoon sun catching on the fresh metals at his chest. He drew a slow breath, feeling the weight of the moment settle across his shoulders. The park had quieted, but the sense of unity and respect lingered in the air, as tangible as the fabric of his new dress blues. He turned, ready to address those who remained, the crisp lines of his uniform catching the light as he stepped forward. He let the silence settle, then spoke in a voice that carried easily across the park. Honor isn't about the fabric of a uniform, or the weight of medals on your chest, he said, his hand resting lightly where the egg had stained the old blues. It's not about how straight you can stand, or how many campaigns you've served. True honor is understanding. It's seeing the person before the uniform, the story before the symbol. He looked toward the protester, who still sat on the curb, the challenge coin turning slowly in his palm. The young man's shoulders were hunched, his jacket creased and dirty, but his attention was fixed on the veteran. Honor is recognizing the humanity in someone you might not agree with. It's listening, even when you think you already know the answer. Sometimes it's forgiveness, especially when anger would be easier. A low murmur passed through the crowd, but no one interrupted. The veteran's words were measured, the tone steady. He wasn't preaching or demanding, just offering his perspective. He stepped forward, boots quiet on the pavement. We all carry stories. Some you can see like medals, scars, or uniforms. Others you can't. My life was saved by men who didn't look like me, didn't speak my language, and owed me nothing. That's what I remember when I wear this uniform. Not the battles, not the politics. The people. He paused, letting the message settle. If you want to honor service, start by seeing the person behind the uniform. Ask questions. Listen. Don't let assumptions or anger blind you to the truth that we share more than we think. The protester gripped the coin more tightly, his gaze lowered. The crowd remained hushed, their phones forgotten, the tension of earlier replaced by something quieter, a sense of reflection, maybe even understanding. The mayor approached, offering a quiet apology and a promise to support veterans in the community. The veteran nodded but kept his focus on the memorial, eyes tracing the engraved names. "This was never about me," he said, voice softer now. "It's about them. The ones who never came home, and the ones whose stories we never hear." He lingered by the stone, fingers hovering near the name Raul Hernandez, Kia 1970, but he didn't touch the granite. The Marines had returned to their vehicles, their presence now just a memory in the cooling air. The crowd began to disperse in small groups, conversation subdued, gestures slower and more thoughtful. As the veteran walked away, his new uniform crisp and unblemished, the applause faded and the park settled into quiet. The protester remained on the curb for a long moment, the coin warm in his hand. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the memorial and the emptying park. If this story moved you, consider subscribing to share more stories of service and redemption. Even as people drifted toward the parking lot and the last of the Marines climbed into their vehicles, the sense of what had happened lingered. The park was nearly empty, the crowd's energy replaced by a thoughtful quiet, and the story, its lessons and regrets remained, waiting for what would come next. After the ceremony, the aftermath unfolded quietly but with lasting consequences. The protester sat on the curb, wrists showing the marks from the cuffs. The police handed him a citation, but the district attorney pressed for more felony assault charges, with the possibility of hate crime enhancements, given the deliberate targeting of a veteran in uniform. The veteran's refusal was simple and final: waste of taxpayer money. He would not sign the complaint, despite the DA's insistence that prosecution would send a message. The Marines loaded into their Humvees, the convoy forming a barrier for a moment longer, before the sergeant major gave the nod. Doors shut in sequence, each movement precise. The engines rumbled, then faded as the vehicles pulled away from the park, leaving behind only the faint smell of diesel and the impression of order restored. There were no goodbyes, no lingering handshakes, just a methodical return to base, as disciplined as their arrival. People lingered near the memorial, uncertain what to do next. Some took photos of the wreath, others stood with hands in their pockets, silent. A few approached the veteran, but he shook his head, preferring to keep the moment private. The new dress blues fit perfectly, but he found himself unconsciously brushing his chest, searching for egg stains that were no longer there. The memory of the incident lingered in the way his shoulders tensed and relaxed, as if trying to let go of something that clung to him. The protester remained on the curb long after most of the crowd had drifted away. He turned the Marine Corps Challenge coin over in his hand, the raised eagle catching the last of the sunlight. When a police officer offered him a ride home, he declined. His jacket was torn at the shoulder, shoes scuffed, his posture less defiant than before. He watched the veteran from across the park but did not approach. The two men, now separated by distance and experience, shared a silence neither seemed eager to break. By dusk, only the cleaning crew moved through the park, gathering discarded programs, water bottles, and stray protest signs. The veteran stood alone at the memorial, his gloved hand resting gently on the granite. He traced the names, each one familiar, each one a story. The fragments of eggshell underfoot crunched softly as he turned to leave, the sound barely audible above the rustling leaves. He walked to his old Ford pickup. The Marine Corps sticker faded on the bumper. For a moment, he paused, looking back at the memorial and the wreath's bright carnations against gray stone. The park lights flickered on, casting long shadows. He started the engine, the sound steady and unhurried. At a red light outside the park, the veteran spotted the protester walking alone, shoulders hunched against the cold. The truck idled beside him. The veteran rolled down the window. "Need a ride?" The protester hesitated, fingers closing around the coin in his pocket before shaking his head. "I'm good." The light changed, and the veteran drove on, watching the young man disappear from the mirror. Back at his apartment, the veteran hung the new uniform in the closet, smoothing the sleeves. The egg-stained blues lay across the bed, waiting to be cleaned. He sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee gone cold, the old photograph of the Mexican workers beside him. Outside, the city settled into its evening rhythm, cars passing, dogs barking, life moving forward. Unseen by either man, the footage of the day's events had already begun to circulate, picked up by bystanders and shared across social media. The story was just beginning to spread. In the days that followed, the incident at the park became a flashpoint for a much larger conversation. Footage of the egg striking the veteran's uniform circulated widely, racking up millions of views across social media and news sites. Headlines debated the meaning of protest, the boundaries of free speech, and the deep respect many hold for those in uniform. Talk radio hosts, columnists, and strangers online weighed in, their opinions reflecting the country's divisions and its reverence for military service. The image of a Marine standing unmoved in his dress blues, streaked with egg, became a symbolon that some saw as resilience, others as provocation, but nearly all recognized as powerful. The veteran, for his part, kept to his routines. He ignored the endless stream of calls and interview requests, letting his phone ring unanswered. At the VFW, the regulars offered him quiet nods and space at the bar. The television above the bottles cycled through muted coverage, but no one paid much attention. The veteran's focus remained on the present: coffee, conversation, and the steady rhythm of familiar faces. Meanwhile, the protester found himself at the center of a storm he hadn't anticipated. His social media filled with messages, some angry, some sympathetic, many simply curious. He shut off notifications and avoided the news. In the city, people recognized him, sometimes staring, sometimes whispering. He withdrew at first, but over time he started showing up at the local immigrant resource center. At first, he sat quietly in the back, listening to ESL lessons and watching volunteers help newcomers navigate paperwork. Gradually, he joined in, offering help where he could, learning names and stories. His presence was met without judgment. The director simply welcomed another set of hands. The story's reach extended beyond the city. At a neighborhood taqueria, the owner printed out a still from the news coverage of Frame, where the veteran mentioned being rescued by Mexican contract workers. She taped it up behind the register, where customers would ask about it. Each time, she'd point to the photo and let the story speak for itself. For some, it was a reminder that history is layered, that gratitude can cross borders and generations. Public officials weighed in as well. The mayor called for community healing, while others debated the proper response to acts of protest. Congressional representatives issued statements, some decrying disrespect, others urging restraint. Online, the debate continued. Was the protesters' act protected speech or an attack on shared values? Was the Marines' restraint a model of dignity or a missed opportunity for justice? The questions didn't resolve easily, but the conversation itself became part of the legacy. For the veteran, legacy was quieter, more personal. He kept his medals polished and his routines unchanged. He didn't need headlines or viral clips to remind him of what mattered. The photograph of the contract workers, creased and fading, remained above his desk, a private tribute to the men who had risked everything for him in another country, under another sky. And in the background, life moved forward. The protester, now a regular volunteer, found a kind of purpose in the slow work of helping others. The veteran, back at the VFW, was greeted with respect, but not fanfare. The story had shifted from spectacle to memory, its impact lingering in small gestures and quiet conversations. As the days settled into routine, the city's attention turned to other matters, but the memory of that morning at the park remained. The veteran's steps, steady and familiar, carried him through the door of the VFW, where the quiet camaraderie of old friends awaited. Inside, the familiar hum of voices and the clink of mugs filled the VFW hall. The place was worn, but steady wood paneling darkened by decades of smoke, flags lining the walls, and a battered jukebox that hadn't worked in years. At the bar, Donnelly nursed a beer, his prosthetic hand resting on the counter. Martinez shuffled a deck of cards at the next table, his movements careful, the nerves in his fingers never quite the same since the war. They acknowledged the veteran with a brief nod, the kind that spoke more than any greeting. The bartender slid a black coffee across the counter. The mug was chipped, The words Semper Fi faded but still legible. He took a sip, the taste sharp and familiar, grounding him in the present. Around him, conversation moved in low-toned talk of car repairs, grandkids' birthdays, the price of gas. No one brought up the incident at the park. They didn't have to. What mattered here was the steady presence of others who understood. Donnelly broke the quiet first, pulling up his sleeve to show the faded tattoo on his forearm, a heart with Yasmin inked inside. Medic gave me this after some locals pulled me out of a burning Humvee in Kuwait, he said. The others nodded. They'd all heard the story before, but it still meant something every time he told it. Martinez dealt out a hand of poker, his cards slapping the table in a practiced rhythm. He told the story of a Filipino fisherman who ferried his platoon through monsoon rains, refusing payment and asking only for crayons to send to his daughter. We mailed a whole box, Martinez said, arranging his cards. Never knew if they made it. The memory hung in the air, unspoken gratitude passing between the men. The veteran rotated his coffee mug, watching the ring it left on the scarred wood. He didn't need to share his story again. Everyone in the room carried their own. Hayes, the youngest at the table, traced the edge of a Marine Corps challenge coin. He spoke about an Afghan boy who had warned his squad about a roadside bomb, his voice faltering as he finished. The veteran slid the coin toward him, a silent offer of reassurance. Hayes hesitated, then left it where it was, but his posture eased. No one watched the muted TV behind the bar, which replayed images from the ceremony. Instead, someone passed around an old photo album, its pages stiff with age. Black and white snapshots showed Marines with local villagers' smiles, arms slung over shoulders, brief moments of peace in the middle of war. The photos made their way around the table, each man pausing, sometimes pointing out a face, sometimes just holding the page a little longer. The bartender refilled mugs, moving quietly, keeping the coffee hot. The talk drifted to weekend plans and upcoming birthdays, the kind of details that made up their new routines. The sense of brotherhood was unspoken but constant, a network of understanding that needed no explanation. As the hour grew late, the group thinned out. Hayes pocketed the challenge coin, his shoulders straighter, the weight of the day a little lighter. The veteran stood, nodded to the others, and stepped outside. Cold air met him as he paused beneath the VFW's flickering sign, the sounds of the city distant and muffled. Through the window, he could see the others still gathered, paging through memories, their laughter low and steady. The night pressed in, and the comfort of belonging lingered, a quiet thread connecting each man to the next. The world outside moved on, but here, the bonds of service and shared experience held firm, unbroken by time or distance. The veteran turned, hands in his pockets, and walked into the night, the warmth of the brotherhood carrying him forward. The next day, in a different corner of the city, the routines would pick up again: cafeteria trays, quiet conversations, and unexpected encounters that could change everything. Some stories don't end with ceremonies or speeches. Sometimes, the most unexpected changes happen in the quiet aftermath, in places where the noise of public attention never quite reaches. In the weeks after the park incident, the routines of daily life resumed, a little more thoughtful, a little less hurried. The VFW remained a steady anchor for the veteran, its doors always open, its regulars always ready with a nod or a refill of coffee. The challenge coin, once a symbol of division, now sat on the bar beside a battered deck of cards, handled by more than one set of hands. The protester's face faded from headlines, but not from memory. He stopped by the VFW one afternoon, hands in his pockets, unsure if he'd be welcomed. The veteran was there, polishing the glass on a framed photograph above the jukebox. The room went quiet for a moment, but no one asked him to leave. He stood near the entrance, glancing at the photos on the wall, snapshots of Marines and families, old parades, unfamiliar faces, smiling in black and white. The bartender poured a cup of coffee and set it on the counter. The protester hesitated, then accepted it with a quiet thanks. He sat at a table in the corner, listening to the low hum of conversation, the scrape of chairs, the shuffle of cards. No one approached him at first. He watched as the veteran moved from table to table, greeting old friends, checking in on the youngest Marine in the room. Eventually, the veteran sat across from him, the challenge coin between them. They didn't talk about the incident. Instead, the conversation drifted to small things: weather, the best place for tamales in the neighborhood, the score of the last baseball game. The protester mentioned a job at a local warehouse, how he'd started volunteering at a food bank on weekends. The veteran nodded, listening without judgment. The coin stayed on the table, a silent reminder of what had passed between them. Other veterans joined in, sharing stories that had nothing to do with medals or uniforms. There was laughter, a few gentle jokes, and the easy camaraderie that comes from shared experience, even if the paths there had been different. The protester relaxed, shoulders easing as the evening wore on. When he finally stood to leave, the veteran pressed the coin into his palm, a gesture that needed no explanation. The final twist wasn't about dramatic forgiveness or public reconciliation. It was about the slow, steady work of understanding, the kind that happens over coffee, across a table scarred by years of use. It was about the willingness to see past a single moment, to recognize the complexity in others, and to accept that change often starts quietly. As the protester left the VFW, the door closed behind him with a gentle chime. Inside, the veteran returned to his usual seat, the noise of the room rising again. Outside, evening settled over the city, and the lessons of that November day lingered in the air, shaping the small choices that would come after. In the end, Gunny Thorne's story is about the danger of assumptions and the power of gratitude. The protester's quick judgment revealed little about the Marine's life, but the veteran's response uncovered something deeper: how honor is shaped by those willing to help, regardless of background. He never forgot the men from Catholic villages who risked execution to save him, and that memory guided his actions long after the war. Honor isn't limited to medals or uniforms. It's found in recognizing shared humanity, remembering kindness, and forgiving those who act out of anger or ignorance. Thorne's actions remind us that respect begins with listening, not labels. Share this story if you believe respect starts with listening.